Welcome to another learning moment. Actually, this could very likely be the last learning moment this time through the course, so hope you find it useful. I've just had a number of students asking, struggling with pop-up modals, right? Just let me refresh your mind on the approach that taught so far. So the idea was if we're going to add a new, in my case, doctor, a lookup value, right? We use this approach of actually navigating to a new page reusing the same create page that we already had with it. Only a couple little modifications. So we have all of our validation is here, all of the code is there for doing our cascading draw. Anyway, anything you have or need is there. I can cancel and go back. It just closes, right? Okay, very valid approach. The reason I focused on this is it's easy, right, to learn, very short learning curve. And, if you have a very complex entity you're working with here, something with, involved in multiple many-to-many relationships, you might have checkboxes and, multi-select list boxes, who knows, whatever, lots of drop-down lists for foreign keys and so on. This is by far, I recommend this approach because that way it's a standalone view. Basically, you're just reusing all the work is there. Think about concurrency, right? All the work is it takes if there's a concurrency error. We've seen how we can actually show, okay, it's been modified by somebody else. Here's the value it currently is in the database. You can decide to save over top of it and so on. That all works beautifully with this approach. But people like, and I agree, if it's just a simple matter of adding a tiny bit of information, why not just have it pop up instead of having to navigate back and click that refresh button? Okay, so we'll look at that. I've done it here in the edit view. So essentially what we're going to see here is instead of going to a new form, notice I have one less button. I can click plus, and then we just have our little pop-up modal for adding a new doctor. I took out the extra unnecessary properties just to keep it simple for the demo, right? Now, the nice thing about this is I still do have client-side validation, right? So there's all my validation error messages, away we go. And if I actually do add a new record, okay, I can create. And there I am in the drop-down list already. I have to click a refresh. So it is a very nice approach. But let me again emphasize, it's a nice approach if you have a nice simple lookup value that you're adding. Then I encourage you to think about doing it this way. Oh, sorry, I forgot that was here. Dave was here. I was playing around. Don't really find a button down in the footer of the modal very useful. So that's why I kind of was taking that out. Okay, so let's look at the code and see how we're doing this. Pardon me. All right. So I guess maybe the first thing we needed in place would be a partial view to be used inside that modal. That's the easiest way to get it up and going. So right now under shared, then I added this partial view, Doctor Create. Now just to show you, if you haven't worked with partial views very much, I can just right click, add a view, and because I started with a shared folder, it actually assumes I probably want a partial view, right? You can actually, use whatever template you want. I did create, I did it for the doctor class, and away we go. So this is a different name. I'm going to delete this when we're done. Just want to point out that you do get a pretty complete view here, even though it's only a partial view, right? So we have the model at the top, our form, anti-forgery token, and so on. Down here, we have a link to go back to index, but a lot of this is unnecessary. We don't need scripts, right? Because this is always going to be hosted, so to speak, inside of a page that already has things like the jQuery validation and so on and so forth. So in the end, one of the biggest fundamental changes, though, is the begin form. So let me actually close this one. This is the version that we're actually using. Notice I've stripped out a lot of extra stuff. I don't need a header at the top. I'm going to do that as part of the modal dialog box. We do need the model, so it can be strongly typed. That's necessary for all of our validation messages and so on and so forth. I have my submit button. I took out everything else, any links and references to the script, because as I said, we just won't need them. A couple of other changes. I did give an ID to our submit button because this button we're going to grab hold of its quick event and take control of exactly what happens, right? So I give that an ID. And as I said, back up here, begin form. Here's a big difference. So instead of just letting it do the default behavior, because remember, this will probably be hosted in something like, well, in our example, a patient edit view, right? So it would want to automatically submit to the patient controller. So we're going to specify, we're going to the create action of the doctor's controller, right? The other thing I'm doing here as an HTML attribute is I'm supplying an ID, create doctor form. That will be useful later on because we're going to have more than one form in the view, right? There's the actual edit for the patient, and of course then we'll have this popping up in the modal, so that makes it easy for us to, in our jQuery or JavaScript, differentiate between the two. So that's a couple of basic changes. Everything else is identical, the same as we have done in the past. Okay, so let's come back to edit now. So here's where we're actually going to use this inside of a modal. So this code, block of code, is right out of the, pretty much out of the online documentation for Bootstrap. I did give it a unique ID here, add doctor modal. Uh, this is boilerplate stuff for most of it though. So we have three main parts of any modal. We have the header, body, and footer. Now actually, see, I'm not even going to use the footer, so I'll actually just comment that out. I could even delete it, whatever, right? Sometimes it's a good spot to put buttons of different sorts, but I like this one. This is the one that provides that little X in the upper right corner, right? So basically what we have here is classes closed, data dismiss modal, and away we go. So we're just showing the little X here with the time symbol, so to speak. So that gives us our easy way to dismiss the dialog box. Okay, I have the modal title, okay, add new doctor, and then inside the body here is where we're rendering our partial view. Now you might wonder, well, what about this line of code? Why do we need to bother creating an actual new empty doctor object, right? Well, the way render partial, excuse me, works is because the view we're working in itself has a defined model, patient, right? So it would assume that when we render partial, that it's going to pass the patient model unless we specify otherwise. So that's the only reason why I really have to do this. I create a doctor object and then pass that as the model for the partial view. And that's it. Other than that, it's just the view that we were just discussing. Okay, now a couple other things, of course, we have to bring this up somehow or other. So that's where that ID will come in handy, our add doctor modal. And of course, inside the partial view is the submit button that we're going to interrupt its click event. Okay, so in terms of the add doctor modal, though, the actual modal dialog box, we're controlling that way down here. Okay, here's that same area we were working before, our drop-down list of doctors, our foreign key. Notice this is actually simpler because we just have one button here, right? Previously we had two with the other approach. But I don't need a link that looks like a button that would navigate to a new page or new tab, right? I'm done with that approach altogether. So I just have one button, okay? Notice that data toggle is modal and data target is my ID of my modal, right? That's the actual functionality that we needed, just these two attributes, so that when I click the button, it actually toggles the modal to be visible and not, right? Okay, gave it an ID, just didn't really need to, but I usually do. And then it has just my glyphicon plus, my plus sign on the button itself. Okay, so that's it for the page itself, except for the script at the bottom. Again, it's a little simpler in that we don't have to call, okay, for that button that we've removed, the refresh drop-down list. What we are doing instead is I'm interrupting the modal itself. It has a couple of events, hide and hidden, okay, before and after the process. So I'm grabbing here the hidden event. So I guess I probably could try the hide. It would probably work. It may even be better because it would, anyway. Here I am thinking out loud in the middle of a recording. Anyway, this one works. So after the modal is hidden, then I call my refresh on the drop-down list. And that's the same code that we had before. I did make one little change. I remember we had this little bit here about fading out the drop down and having it reappear, just so visually there was a clue that it had been refreshed. Well, we already have the modal box disappearing, so I kind of found that that was unnecessary, so I took that out here just with commenting it out. Okay, so that's the same thing. So when the modal disappears, it automatically refreshes the drop down list. Okay, so here's my submit create. Okay, that's the name of the submit button in my partial view. that goes in the modal, right? So with click event, first thing we do is we prevent default because we do not want to actually submit anywhere and navigate away from our patient's controller. So what I do instead then is I grab the actual form. Now that's where it helps that I gave an ID to the create doctor form, right? So we can grab that form by its ID. And this is a key line. What this does is it forces that client-side validation that we're so thankful to have, right? All of our regular expressions or whatever, all the annotations that we put in our model class that are providing client-side validation still get a chance to work for us. If we didn't do this one step here, it would never ever call that. So we can wrap it in an if because it'll return true or false, and that will cause the validation to happen. Now, mind you, of course, this is not going to help with any database errors and things like that, concurrency and so on. Right? But at least we get a chance to check the common basic data validation errors on the client. Then we just do our AJAX request, right? It'll be a post, and because I grabbed my form as an object, I can just get the action attribute and set that to the URL of my AJAX request. And then all the data that's inside the form, I can just go .serialize and send that as the data in the request. And that's as simple as that. I just check for success. If we get a success code back, status code 200, then I just hide the modal, right? So I just refer to the actual modal dialog, call it hide, and then that will, of course, automatically then trigger this one up here, which will force the refresh of the drop-down list itself, right? If we get an error, then I'll just bring up an alert, create failed, there was a problem adding the doctor. Now, it is true. You can get fancy and actually put database errors, model errors, and so on in the response coming back, most likely using JSON or something. But then that's just another added level of complexity trying to deserialize it all and get it up in messages and so on. So you know what? In the scope of this demo, I'm just going to leave that out because as I said, I really only encourage this approach if you have a nice simple model, a quick lookup, city names, things like that that you want to do, right? So that is probably sufficient for everything that we're going to actually need. And that basically is all of the code involved, right? So just oh, there is one more important thing. I almost forgot. In the doctor's controller, because we pass this to the create action in the doctor's controller, we do need to differentiate here. And fortunately, we can easily do so. Did we come here from the normal process of creating doctors or through our AJAX request, right? So here, my normal logic, this is the standard, check if the model state is valid, add the doctor, save changes, right? But instead of doing our normal, okay, return view or redirect to action, whatever, here's our test. Okay, we have to add this for an AJAX request. So if, okay, it's not an AJAX request, then we're going to do the code that we had here already, right? Now this code is there strictly to support that older approach, right? Where we were popping up in a new tab and so on. Otherwise, it'd be even simpler. But the point is, if it's an AJAX request, then I just have to, because we're in here, we're at this stage because we've successfully saved changes. I'm just returning a new status code, right? Just HTTP status code OK. And that just lets my AJAX request know that we had that success, right? Now, of course, if there was a validation issue, right, that wasn't caught on the client or some data exception, anything like that, okay, then what I'll do is I wouldn't get to this part of the code unless there was a problem. So once again, if it's an AJAX request, then I'll return the status code result, bad request, right? This, I'm not even accessing this message right now. That's something I thought we could get into, but it'll just add unnecessary complexity. But getting the bad request just lets us know that it did not succeed. The else of this if structure then just does our normal return view doctor, okay, after populating the drop-down list to let us fix whatever validation errors in the normal course of using the controller instead of through AJAX. So that's another important point to make is that we do have to check and decide how to handle the action result here, depending on whether it's an AJAX request or not. Because we don't want to redirect off to some other view, right? Definitely not. We just want to return a status result for the most part. Okay, so hopefully you'll find this is somewhat helpful. Again, it's something I'd emphasize is good if you have a simple entity that you're just adding, something without complex relationships involved in many to many or even a lot of foreign keys and so on. Then by all means go ahead and just be able to click plus. We'll add our new doctor, Dr. What's Dr. Frankenstein? I couldn't spell it anyway. Uh, F F, right? Dr. Frankenstein. And we see immediately it's right there in the drop down list, alphabetically ordered and so on, right? Okay, so if you like that technique, feel free. Just remember, it's only really, I encourage you for simple, simple situations. All right, have a good summer.